Today is February 10, 2017, and we're going to be discussing a bit of the community rule and the spirit of truth and the spirit of falsehood. But before we do that, let's ask our Heavenly Family to guide us. Eloheinu, Heavenly Family, Todah le'emet, thank you for truth. Thank you for guiding us and doing so as such a loving and tender shepherd would care for sheep. Thank you for helping us, even though we have been so unloving and so merciless and so wayward in our own ways. Thank you for not giving up on us, but continuing to seek after us and to find us and to take a hold of us so that we can go home with you. Thank you so much. Please guide us to have the love that you have. Bind us together in that love, Heavenly Family, and help us to fulfill your will on earth as it is in heaven.
Amen.
So guide us to understand our subject this evening, and through it to be convicted of sin and righteousness and judgment, and to be drawn to see in reason and in truth the message that you have for us. Todah, thank you. We ask this b'shem tzemach, Huahi, in the name of Branch, he and she. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so as we spoke of last weekend, we want to get back into the community rule. And in this meeting, I want to just kind of recap a little bit of that. I mean, we already did last weekend kind of talking about the community rule as a whole and its importance and a few other things surrounding the community rule. But I'll briefly mention a couple things again, and then I want to focus on this section of the two spirits, which is the section that we are currently in our investigation. And we'll kind of get a broad view of that, and we may not have time to just get into the next aspect. That may be, only tomorrow night that we get into the next aspect of the spirit of falsehood, picking up where we left off in our previous studies on the community rule. But it's really important to have this big picture, and this teaching of the two spirits is one worthy of reminding ourselves, since it is so central and key to the whole message and to how all things really are. All right, so the community rule is a document which was found in a collection of writings known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. And you may have noticed, those of you on Facebook, that recently another cave was found. Up until, I believe it was February 8th, 2 days ago. You guys could check on Facebook. We posted several articles on the Branch Davidian SDA Facebook page concerning this. But up until this point, ever since 1956, all the world has known concerning the Dead Sea Scrolls is that they were found in 11 caves near the site of Qumran, which is on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea in the land of Israel. But as of February 8th, it is now known that there was at least one more cave And in one of the articles which we posted, written by a scholar by the name of Craig Evans, he indicated that the archaeologists involved in finding Cave 12 also indicated that there may be a Cave 13, though that is yet to be verified. In Cave 12, no new scrolls were found, though there were remains of pottery that were just like the pots that were found in other caves, themselves containing scrolls. And also there were leather bands that were used to hold scrolls together. There's also fragments of parchment, which was in the making to become a scroll, and several other things. There was also some pickaxes from the 1940s. And so what the conclusion that most people come to so far is, or essentially the conclusion to which most people have come thus far, is that this is a scroll in which caves were found in the 1940s by Bedouin, and then they just left it in a mess. No one has found it since. The scrolls which were in the cave, no one knows where they are or where they went, whether Bedouin kept them and it's still floating around somewhere, or whether they ended up being sold to the archaeologists and are already known and part of the collection, but they have been assigned to another cave. Those are all things to consider. But the finding of this cave is highly significant in that it shows that all this time there's been another cave there and people have not taken note of it. And so there may be other caves that people have not taken note of which do contain significant things. The discovery of this Cave 12, by the way, is one of the two primary discoveries of a certain operation started several months ago. And again, several months ago we posted some things on Facebook concerning this. But it's a certain project which is being conducted by the Israeli Antiquities Authorities in conjunction with some others to search through the Judean desert and find whatever remaining scrolls and artifacts there may be. And there's one cave known as the Cave of the Skulls, in which some scrolls were found, though in such a state that they have not yet been able to read them. But these two finds are both quite significant, and this is only a couple months into this project, so we may have before us some quite significant finds. I would, in fact, be quite surprised if we don't. This is a bit of an aside from our subject, but I just wanted to mention it because in recapping the story of the scrolls to some extent, we now have to alter our view of it. Rather than just simply saying 11 caves, we have to say at least 12 caves and possibly more. And also I wanted to mention it for those of you who may not have seen the Facebook posts so that you know to keep your eyes open, because there may be much more before us. Anyway, what the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found in the 1940s and 50s really are is a collection of writings which was preserved among a sect of Jews which most scholars identify as Essenes from the 2nd century BCE up into the 1st century CE. And what is quite remarkable is that among these writings, not only were there copies of older compositions such as Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, etc. Not only were there writings like that and like First Enoch and the Book of Jubilees and others, but there were writings which were composed within the group that preserved the scrolls. Writings which are unique to the Essenes or to the Qumran movement, and perhaps the clearer way to refer to them is writings which spring from the movement founded by a figure known in the scrolls as Moreh Hatzedek, the teacher of righteousness, or the righteous teacher. Certain Dead Sea Scrolls refer to this figure and his teachings, and other Dead Sea Scrolls seem to have been even written by him, such as the Thanksgiving hymns, Barki Nafshi, and potentially several others. And in addition to the Dead Sea Scrolls providing the oldest scriptural manuscripts that we currently have in our possession in the modern world, in addition to that, they provide for us a collection of writings which evidently form a part of the foundation or somewhat of a precursor to Jesus' teachings and the teachings of the movement which he started, of course, known anciently as the Nazarene movement. The Nazarene movement was a certain type of, or the Nazarene movement being a part of Judaism was a certain type of Judaism. You had Pharisaic Judaism. You had the Judaism of the Sadducees. You had the Judaism of the Zealots. You had various Baptist groups interested in ritual cleansings by means of immersion. You had the Essenes, or the Children of Light, and several other groups. Well, this Jesus movement, what type of Judaism were they? Is it a totally unique thing with no connection to any other group? Or did they perhaps have their root in another group? Did they spring up from within another group? Were their teachings more so aligned with one group than with others? And what we have found is that, and this is something that scholars have taken note of since the 1940s and 50s, coming up to the present day, is that there are many things which were at one time thought to be unique to the teachings of Jesus and his followers, which, since the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, have now been seen to be already present in the writings of this group, which was founded by the Moreh Hatzedek, the teacher of righteousness. And in our studies, what we have found is that there, if you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls and the writings which come from this community, and you look at the teachings of Jesus and the letters of Paul and the Gospels in the New Testament and even beyond the New Testament, there are points of contact between these writings, the Nazarene writings, and the Qumran writings or the Essene writings. Some of these points of contact show agreement and some of them show disagreement. The Damascus document, for instance, advocates for one to not help an animal out of the pit on the seventh-day Sabbath. That teaching is clearly contradicted by the teaching of Jesus. So there's some disagreement there. But the Damascus document evidences from within itself a date which comes after the time of the teacher of righteousness. The teacher of righteousness, the time in which he lived can be at least roughly determined by certain texts within the Dead Sea Scrolls, including the Damascus document itself. And he seems to have arisen as this teacher and even a prophet in sometime around the 170s BCE. Now, the Damascus document places itself a bit later, and it refers to the teacher of righteousness in past tense. But there are other writings which seem to be earlier and which form more of a foundation for this whole movement surrounding the teacher of righteousness. Again, some of these writings seem to be the Thanksgiving hymns, the Barti Nafshi texts, and several others. And included among them is this one particular writing that we've been studying called the Community Rule. In Hebrew, Serek ha-Yahad. That's the rule, Serek, of the community. Ha-Yahad. The community or the unity. And it's a way to refer to the group, and it's not just the group in one particular location, but it's all of those who are bound by this common teaching springing from the instructor or the master, which is one of the key terms which the teacher of righteousness uses to identify himself in the Thanksgiving hymns and other texts. So we've been studying this community rule, and the reason why is because it, perhaps more than any other document thus far known from the Dead Sea Scrolls, outlines the mission, the identity, the teachings, and the organizational structure of the movement surrounding the teacher of righteousness. It is a sort of writing which has its genre shared with other writings such as the Didache, or the teaching. The longer name is the Teaching of the 12 Apostles. This is a writing which scholarly consensus today says that the foundation or the core of that writing goes back to the 50s of the first century, that being the time of the apostles themselves. And the Didache, which we currently have in our possession, gives us sort of constitution, primary teachings and function, constitution and bylaws, as it were, of the Nazarene movement. There are other writings which we can look at and compare them to see, a similar sort of function within a community. To give a more modern example, the Leviticus of Davidian Seventh-day Adventists seems to have the same sort of purpose for the Davidian movement as the community rule had for the movement surrounding the teacher of righteousness. So the Leviticus of Davidian Seventh-day Adventists gives the basic teachings, the purpose, the mission, and the organizational structure of the Davidian movement. Likewise, the community rule does the same, again, for the movement surrounding the teacher of righteousness. This makes it a highly significant document for us to study. And so far, we have been studying it, and we have studied up to about line 11 or so of column 4 of the primary primary copy of this document from among the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are several copies of the community rule that were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. There was the primary one, which was one of the first 7 scrolls to be found, in late 1946, early 1947, and it is known as 1QS. 1 is referring to the cave. It is the first cave, Cave 1. Q is Qumran, which is the name of the site which the caves surround. And then S stands for Serek, rule, which is the first word of the title of this document. And there were several other copies found in Cave 4, and they have certain differences. And when we come to a little bit later, perhaps when we get to column 5 of 1QS, then we'll have to start talking about these other copies as well. But there's this primary copy, because it's best preserved. It's very, very well preserved, and it's, again, 1QS. It has 11 columns. Remember, these documents come to us from a time before books and before the form of written documents from which books derived, that being the codex. Starting sometime in probably the 1st century of the Common Era, they're developed in most likely the Roman military what became known as the codex, which is taking several leaflets and binding them together on one side so that you could write on both sides and flip them, flip the pages. It's kind of like a book. Before that, people would write on scrolls. And what they would do to make scrolls was they would sew together pieces of parchment, different sections, into one long piece of parchment, and then they would be able to roll it up and then keep it as a scroll. And if you're going to read that, you can't flip through pages because there are no pages. So what they would do is they would start on one side. In Hebrew, one writes from right to left, and so they would start on the right side of this scroll, and they would designate a column, and they would write one column, and then to the left of that column, they would put the second column, and the left of that, they would put the third column, and so on. And so 1QS, the best preserved copy of the community rule, has 11 columns. We have studied again to about column 4, line 11. And in our investigations so far, we have been asking questions like, is this teaching righteousness? Is this promoting truth? Or, conversely, is this teaching wickedness and promoting falsehood? Are these, now this is our primary question, really. Like, this is ultimately what it comes down to. But we're asking several questions along these lines as we're reading. So that's our primary question. In order to help ourselves to think about that, we are looking at other things like, does this statement have any parallels in other ancient writings which we're aware of? Is it basing itself on other writings? And we've found, for instance, that in column 2, where it describes a annual ceremony of entering into the covenant, it bases itself very much so on either the book of Deuteronomy or a text which is almost identical to the book of Deuteronomy.
Trent?
And so, yes?
Were you aware that there was a long section there that we weren't able to hear you? At least I couldn't.
No, I was not aware of that. Anyone else mention whether...
Yeah, you broke out for a while, and then you came back.
We had no pause at all in Michigan.
Sorry, say that again?
No pause at all in Michigan?
Well, Mary and I had no pause at all. Like, everything came through perfectly clear.
Really?
Good.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't hear anything too in California.
Okay, good. So perhaps it was just on the two lines.
Well, Rachel, do you mean that you didn't hear anything, that everything came through clearly?
Yeah, I mean clearly.
Yeah. Okay.
Excellent.
Well, it must be on the recording then.
That's sort of
I'm
strange.
It went blank up here in Washington, too, for quite a while.
Interesting.
Well, maybe you should try to repeat it. Just
Yeah, same thing
Okay.
here
Besides
from
that-
my line.
You had silence too, Christina?
Yeah, you guys cut out for quite a long time and then came back.
Okay. That's very interesting.
So yeah, no, I've just been consistently talking away. So I will I will recap some of the things that I said, going from the Codex forward. So a codex is basically the ancient form of what we would call a book. Technically, this is pre-book. They would often be bound together on one side by either leather straps or metal rings of some sort, and then these pages would be written on both sides. You could flip from page to page. It was very convenient. It was initially used as essentially notebooks for people in the Roman military. The scrolls that we are referring to, and notice I say scrolls, are from a time before the existence of the Codex. Before the Codex was invented in the 1st century of the Common Era, almost all documents were written on scrolls, of course, unless it was an engraving on a stone or something like that. But most writing was on scrolls. Scrolls were created by taking many pieces of parchment and sewing them together into one long strip, and then it would be written upon in columns, and then it could be rolled up and preserved, whether in jars or in boxes or whatever it may be. Hebrew is written from right to left, and so Hebrew scrolls would start on the right side, and the scribe would designate the space for one column, and they would write that column, and then they would go to the left of that and write the second column, and go to the left of that and write the third column, and so on. And so when we're talking about the community rule and the various copies of it found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, they were written upon scrolls, not in codices, not in books, certainly, and they were simply written on scrolls. And the primary document that is studied for, or the primary copy, I should say, of the community rule that is studied is known as 1QS. I'll just mention there's a line that's not on mute and there's some noise coming through. Thank you. Okay, so 1QS, this is the designation for a particular copy of the community rule found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. 1 stands for the number of the cave, that is cave 1. Q stands for Qumran, which is the settlement which is in close proximity to the caves which contained the scrolls. And S stands for Serek, which would be spelled in English Serek, which is the Hebrew word for rule, which is kind of it's not like a particular rule necessarily, but it's like, you know, this is the rule of conduct or something like that. So this is the community rule, the rule of the community. So 1QS is this particular copy of the community rule, and it has 11 columns. We have studied up 2, about column 4, line 11. And in our investigation of it so far, we have been asking questions such as, is this teaching truth? Is this promoting righteousness? Or, conversely, is this teaching error? Is this promoting wickedness? We have asked, though we have not come to a conclusion on it yet, who wrote this? When was it written? For what purpose was it written? What is this all about? And let me ask you guys, were you able to hear me explain the aspect of how the community rule serves as kind of a constitution and bylaws for the movement surrounding the teacher of righteousness in much the same way that the Didache served as such for the Nazarene movement and the Leviticus of Davidians of the Adventists served as such for the Davidian movement?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so this has been our investigation so far, and in studying this so far and asking, and actually, you know what, there's one other element I should mention. So our primary question has simply been, is this true? That's the main thing. And in order to find the answer to that question, for each line and each phrase as we have gone through in our investigation of this particular text, we have asked other questions that might help to illuminate our understanding of what we are reading, because how wrong would it be to ask whether or not this is true and then judge whether it is true based on our misinterpretation of what it indeed says. And this can very easily happen. Even today, people misinterpret what others say all the time. How much more so when we're dealing with a text that was written over 2,000 years ago by people in a very different setting, with a very different language, with a very different perspective on the world. We could easily misunderstand what they're saying. So we have to ask serious questions in order to cancel out our own misinterpretations of this text, and in order to verify what it is really saying and judge it according to its own teaching and whether that teaching aligns with the way things really are or not. And so we have been asking many serious questions, and I can't go and recap all of what we have been asking while studying the community rule. Again, the studies that we have had are currently in the process of being edited by Teresa and will soon be on the YouTube channel, and some of them have already been sent out in email. So I really, and we both really encourage you guys to go over these studies again, because there was a lot. And I know that some people at first with the community rule, it was like, I don't know, it's something I don't like about the community rule for whatever reason, and different people may have had different reasons. And in studying it, though, what we found is that all of us were like, okay, wow, wait a second. If we're looking at the community rule as something negative, we're missing something, because this is clearly promoting truth and love and peace and righteousness and so on and so forth. And all of us, and you guys can go back and listen to the recordings and hear each other and hear yourself come to a realization of what the community rule is in fact teaching. Mm-hmm. And I really, it's hard for me to imagine anyone going back and listening to those studies and not realizing, like, wow, this text is very important and very timely for our present needs.
Yes.
And so clearly promoting the principles of truth and righteousness. In fact, the community rule distinctly lays out these principles, perhaps more clearly than any other text that we have investigated. And this particular section, which we are currently in our investigations, that being the section concerning the two spirits, the spirit of truth and the spirit of falsehood, lay this out most clearly. Yes?
I just wanted to mention, in the emails that I send the MP3s through, I have been encouraging you all to listen to the MP3s, but I haven't really stressed it as much as I might want to. But I'll just say that, you will be blessed tremendously if you will go and listen to those again. Or if you weren't on for the meetings, to hear them for the first time, it will be very important for you to do, because, for one, you need to be testing this for yourself, too, and it will help guide you through, and you have a whole host of evidence and references. That's the word I'm looking for. You have a whole host of references to help in your investigation. It's not exhaustive, but it's very thorough.
Absolutely, and the reason why there's a whole host of references is because the community rule is not a standalone text, independent of every other text in the world. No, it bases itself off of things. It quotes previous scriptures. It quotes Isaiah. It quotes Deuteronomy. It refers to the law of Moses. It has a lot of contact with texts prior to it, and texts following it also make contact with it. Some historians have concluded by a careful study of the Gospel of John with the community rule that almost certainly the author of the Gospel of John had at least parts of the community rule committed to memory. Also, in previous studies, we found that there's another collection of texts, specifically 42 texts, 42 hymns, called the Odes of Solomon, which were written by an individual, or perhaps individuals, but possibly just one individual from among the early Nazarenes. And these Odes of Solomon have so much that they draw on from within the community rule and the Thanksgiving hymns. The Odes of Solomon is another witness to the early Nazarene community. And so there's a lot of connection here, and it's really important for us to understand. So now I want to focus in a bit on this section that we are in, which is concerning the two spirits, or the two ways. First, I'll just briefly mention kind of the sections leading up to this. So the first section of the community rule simply introduces it and states its purpose and mission and what it means to join the community which is described in the community rule. And then it describes a covenant ceremony that is to be done annually, by means of which people enter the community. And that whole section leads us up to about line 13 of column 3. And then in line, again, 13 or 14 of column 3, yeah, there was some sort of noise. I don't know if someone's not on mute.
Or maybe wanted to say something?
Yeah, just a real quick question. This is Ed.
Sure.
Before we get into it, I wondered if you could just talk for just a brief second about the connection of the Nazarene sect with the Essenes sect, if there is one, or
sure.
if they... Okay, thanks.
Yeah, no, that's an extremely important question. Okay, so the Nazarenes started in the 20s of the first century of the Common Era. So Common Era CE, or you could say AD. And AD means it's the same thing. One is just a Christian way to refer to it. The other is more broad. So in the 20s, so Jesus, he started his ministry in the year 27 of the Common Era. And he was preceded by, of course, as we all know, John the Baptist, or John the Baptizer, the Immerser. And John was the forerunner of Christ. So the Nazarene movement, just from knowing that, and this is quite interesting, each of the Gospels in the New Testament, before getting into Jesus, talks about John. And there are other references to John the Baptist. You know, Josephus talks about John the Baptist. He was clearly a very important figure, and he was the forerunner of Jesus. And so the Jesus movement, the Nazarene movement, did not just suddenly show up out of nowhere with no preceding group. They really are a successor group to John the Baptist group. So they come from a certain type of Judaism. That's John the Baptist's type of Judaism, not from another type of Judaism, like the Sadducees, let's say. So how about John the Baptist? Does he have any previous history to his type of Judaism? Is he building on another type of Judaism? Or did he just kind of spring out of nowhere and start something independent of any other group? So what I'm doing right now is basically describing a historical connection between the Jesus movement, that's the Nazarenes, John's movement, and moving back in time to what preceded it. However, that's only one way to do it, so I'm going to do that first, and then I'm going to mention some other elements. So there is, in fact, a connection between John the Baptist and the Essenes. When Josephus talks about the Essenes, he says that they number about 4,000 people at the time in which he was referring to them, and that they were scattered kind of, in the countryside, beside villages and cities and all of that, kind of on the outskirts, throughout the land of Judah and Israel, even up into Galilee. And that's very much so in harmony with, and actually before I go on, I want to say Josephus, some of you, of course, probably all of you are already familiar with the fact that he was a first century Jewish historian. He was a priest. He witnessed the destruction of the temple. He ended up siding with the Romans and ended up in Rome, and he wrote a whole bunch of writings, including Jewish Wars and Antiquities of the Jews, and autobiography, and a couple other things. So he's a very important witness to the history of what went on in Judea in the first century and before. There's another writer who is a Jew from Alexandria, Egypt, who is actually a contemporary with Jesus, and I think he died in the 30s or something like that, and he, lived in the 20s and in the teens and so on, going back. I think he was born in the 1st century BCE. His name is Philo, and some of his writings are preserved today, and he talks about the Essenes as well. And he describes them, and his description is very much so in harmony with the description of Josephus. There's another writer, a Roman writer named Pliny. He describes the Essenes, and he gives a very useful piece of information. concerning the headquarters, as it were, of the Essenes being on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. He describes it as being in the same place as Qumran. And with that designation, and also with the description of the Essenes that he gives, that Philo gives, and that Josephus gives, these are our primary sources for the Essenes pre-Dead Sea Scrolls discovery. So with all the information that they provide, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, it was like, okay, wow, this group of Jews who composed these scrolls represents a type of Judaism which is different from the Judaism of the Pharisees, the Judaism of the Sadducees. It's definitely not Samaritan, and it's not a zealot group. What is this? And by comparing the scrolls themselves with the descriptions of the Essenes by Philo, Josephus, and Pliny, it has been determined, and it has held long, it's basically stood the test of time, that group that had the Dead Sea Scrolls was a form of what these other writings refer to as Essene Judaism. But there were other, Essene groups, as it were. They weren't all in agreement on absolutely everything. And the scrolls themselves do not refer to their authors using the name Essene. It seems to be a name that people from outside the group used to refer to them. But this group has its origins sometime in the 2nd century BCE. Now, what's interesting about John the Baptist, and there's way more about this that I can get into now, but John the Baptist, he did his primary work. He lived in the desert growing up, Luke records. Where was he in the desert? He comes from a priestly family. The Qumran group is a priestly group, but there are, of course, other priestly groups that are not connected with Qumran and everything. But John, he went off into the wilderness, and where he was located is actually like within a mile or two of Qumran. That's where he was doing his baptizing. Like, he was literally right there beside them. And then when you look at his teachings and his practices, it looks remarkably similar to what we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. John the Baptist, his mission, in his own understanding, was set by the prophecies of Isaiah, particularly Isaiah chapter 40. There's the voice of one crying, "In the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord," or "prepare ye the way of the Lord." Now notice I said that differently than how you guys might be used to hearing it. Throughout time, there's been much interpretation of Isaiah's prophecies. And most people reading Isaiah 40 verse 3 read, "And there's a voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord." So there's a voice crying in the wilderness, and the voice says, "Prepare ye the way of the Lord." That's not how John took it. John took it like this. There's a voice of one crying. And what does it cry? "In the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord." And that is why John was in the wilderness, and that is what was his prophetic calling from the Scriptures. Now, what is significant is that there's only one other group that is known that interpreted Isaiah 40 verse 3 in the same way, and that used it as the foundation for their mission, and that was the Qumran group. They took it as there's the voice of one crying, and it cries, "In the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord." Okay, very, very interesting. Same thing. John and Qumran, same thing, nowhere else. No one else has that, but they have it, and they're right there beside each other. And John is said to have been raised in the wilderness. Well, what's he doing there? Like, he can't, like, that part of Judea, you can basically, like there's not really much to survive on. Okay, so that's one aspect, and that's a very strong connection of some sort. But there are many other connections. For instance, John, he was proclaiming the coming of the Messiah. And when John was sent to prison, he sent some of his disciples to Jesus saying, "Are you the coming one, or do we look for another?" And how does Jesus reply? He tells the disciples, "Go and tell John what you have seen and what you have heard and what you have witnessed. The sick are healed, the lame walk, the blind see, the dead are raised to life, etc. The glad tidings are preached." Okay, well, what's that about? Why is he referencing that? John's wanting to know, are you the coming one, or do we look for another? And this is how he replies? Well, what does that mean? Why is that? It sounds like this is what is known as a high context conversation. In other words, it's like an inside dialogue. It's Jesus and John spoke the same language. They could communicate like that, and they'll understand what they're talking about, whereas someone coming from the outside might not understand. They're not just speaking totally plainly so that a Roman would stand there and listen, "Oh, that's what you're talking about." A Roman won't stand there, or a modern English-speaking Christian or Jew or whoever won't just stand there and hear John the Baptist or John the Baptist's disciples ask Jesus, "Hey, look, John wanted us to come and ask you, are you the coming one, or do we look for another?" And Jesus replies, "The lame walk, the blind see, the dead are raised, the glad tidings are preached," etc. Well, no, that's not meaningful. It doesn't sound like he's answering their question. But obviously, what's going on is that this is a high context conversation. In other words, it is Jesus' answer is framed in such a way that it is for those who know what he's talking about. I could talk to you guys, and I could use certain phrases and certain terms and refer to certain things, and you'll know what I'm talking about because you're studying this message. And if someone isn't studying this message and they hear me saying some of those things, they aren't going to understand it unless we explain it to them in terms that they will understand. So here's the thing. What Jesus said to John's disciples sounds a lot like a passage in Isaiah, I believe it's in chapter 61. But it's not really the same. In Isaiah, it talks about the blind seeing and so on, and the glad tidings preached, but it doesn't say anything about raising the dead. And it doesn't really connect that with a coming one or anything like that. It doesn't connect that with the Messiah. But there's a text in the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's one of these texts that these Essenes had that does speak of the Messiah. And it says, "The heavens and the earth shall listen to his Messiah." Well, this Messiah is not just any old anointed one. This is a significant Messiah who the heavens and the earth listen to. And then it describes what this Messiah does, and it describes the Messiah as doing these things that Jesus mentioned, causing the blind to see, the lame to walk, the sick to be healed, the dead to be raised, and the glad tidings preached. Well, now it makes sense John's asking about the Messiah. Jesus responds by citing a list of things that this Dead Sea Scroll says the Messiah will do. That's something meaningful to John, but it only makes sense in the light of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the writings that were housed and preserved by these Essenes. There are many other connections with John the Baptist. Both the Essenes and John the Baptist were ascetic. They practiced self-denial. They not only they basically had restricted diets and lived in a way that today might be described as minimalist. They didn't have many possessions. John only had his one garment and so on. He restricted his diet. He practiced self-denial. He didn't engage in fleshly pleasures and all of that sort of thing. The Qumran group did the same. Both were immersing groups. The Qumran movement, at Qumran, there were discovered through archaeology several mikveot, ritual baths for ritual purification. Well, that's what John was doing. He was baptizing, doing these immersions. And that was, of course, carried on in the Jesus movement, the Nazarene movement as well. So that's just one more connection. There are actually several other connections. There are also indications that John may have actually taken the vow described in the community rule, and then at some point either left the Qumran community or was kicked out. There are things that seem to strongly indicate that as being the case. So there's demonstrated connection between the Nazarenes and John the Baptist, and there's also demonstrated connection between John the Baptist and the Essenes. So that shows that the form of Judaism from which the Nazarene movement emerged ultimately is an Essene form of Judaism. But I do want to say, John, when he started preaching, in some way separated or was separated from the Qumran community. Either they kicked him out or he left. They were separate. And there were points of disagreement. And you see Jesus rebuking the sons of light in the New Testament. The sons of light is the term used for those who follow the way of the teacher of righteousness by those who purport to follow that way. So I want to mention that, again, the teacher of righteousness was a figure from the first half of the 2nd century. So again, the 2nd century spans from
BCE.
Yes, BCE. Yes, so
implied, but I thought I would just still state it.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So, he comes from about the 170s, and who knows how long his prophetic ministry lasted. But, maybe 170s, 160s, 150s, who knows for sure? We don't exactly know. But he was in, he started his work in, the first half, perhaps even the first quarter of the 2nd century BCE. Well, man, that's a lot of time between that and John the Baptist. And evidently, this movement that was formed surrounding the teacher of righteousness had changes in that time. After the teacher of righteousness died, they didn't necessarily keep the exact same form of religion that he had. I mean, every religion develops and changes over time. I mean, look at Adventism from its beginning up to the time that the Shepherd's Rod message came on the scene. And this is actually a fitting analogy. You could look at the Qumran community as being parallel to Adventism. And then you have, from the time of the founding of the Qumran community to the time of John the Baptist, is, about 200 years. Well, that's a significant period of time in which a lot of changes can take place. Likewise, looking at the Seventh-day Adventist movement, starting in 1844, well, there's not quite 200 years going up to the time of Victor Houteff, but if you look at the Advent movement, you're still dealing with almost 100 years. That's a lot of development that takes place during that time, and especially if you look at the time between the death of Ellen White and the arrival of the Shepherd's Rod message, there was a lot of change. However, that change did start long before. So you could say, just to kind of look at the relationship between the groups, on one hand you have Seventh-day Adventism, and then the Davidian movement from within that, and then the branch movement from that. Well, it's kind of the same, or at least it's analogous in some way to look at, okay, so you have the Qumran movement, and from that came the John the Baptist movement, and from that came the Nazarene movement. So you have the Essene movement and the Seventh-day Adventist movement parallel. You have the Davidian movement and the John the Baptist movement parallel, and you have the branch movement and the Nazarene movement paralleled. That's kind of showing you kind of their relationship in some way. It's not necessarily going to be exactly that same way because they come from different times with different contexts and different overall settings and situations and all of that, but it's somewhat similar, how those groups formed and how they relate to each other. It could be that the majority of Essenes would not consider Jesus and his movement to be true Essenes or to be true followers of the teacher of righteousness. But that doesn't mean that the followers of Jesus did not consider themselves to be true followers of the teacher of righteousness. I don't think that there's any evidence that they considered themselves Essenes, but I don't know of any evidence that the Essenes consider themselves Essenes. That's not a name that shows up in the community rule or in any of the Dead Sea Scrolls or anything like that. All the writings that we know of that use the term Essene are written by people who do not consider themselves to be Essenes. So this is why the way that I prefer to describe these relations, I will ask questions like, did Jesus and John the Baptist and the followers of Jesus, did they consider the teacher of righteousness to be a true prophet? We know that they had to have considered him to be either a true prophet or a false prophet. Which was it? That's like asking, okay, did Ben Roden and Lois Roden consider Ellen White to be a true prophet? Do they place themselves in a line proceeding from Ellen White? Whether the vast body of people who profess to believe that Ellen White was a true prophet would consider Ben and Lois to be true is another question. But do they consider themselves from within that line? So that's what we're asking about Jesus and John and all of that. And every indication that we have so far is that John the Baptist, Jesus, Paul, and the followers of Jesus and so on, they considered themselves to be in the line of the teacher of righteousness, and thus would, in that sense, stem from that group, which at least outsiders called the Essenes. Those are kind of the nuances that we're dealing with. Does that help to answer your question?
That was amazing and great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, excellent. That's awesome. I hope that it was beneficial for everyone. So, yeah, I'm very glad that you asked that question. And this is a huge subject. I mean, there's a lot that could be said concerning the Dead Sea Scrolls. And, of course, the relation of the scrolls to the writings of the followers of Jesus and all of that. And I am really, really looking forward to seeing what archaeologists today find as they are actively searching through the Judean desert looking for scrolls and artifacts and all of that, who knows what they could find.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have any writings from John the Baptist. Did he ever write anything? We don't know, one way or the other. Did any of his followers write anything? Well, perhaps, and when I say his followers, I'm talking in the immediate context. We know that the disciples of John continued as an independent group after the Nazarene movement started. That's witnessed to in Acts, it's witnessed to in the Clementine recognitions, and in other texts as well, in the Gospels of the New Testament and so on. So there's a lot for us to yet learn, but there's a lot. I'm trying to say two different things using two similar language. There's a lot for us to learn that we do not yet even know or have available for our knowledge or our investigation, but which we may soon. And then there's a lot for us to learn from what we have immediately before us. And that's why we cannot afford to not investigate the community rule and these other texts, because there is a connection between these texts and the people related to these texts and the movement of the Nazarenes and the writings which that movement produced. So, that said, this is highly significant. And one of these themes, which we find in both movements, that being the movement surrounding the teacher of righteousness. Again, you'll note that I hesitate to refer to them as Essenes all the time. I do think that Josephus and Philo and Pliny are describing a group which the Qumran community is a part of. And so in that sense, I think that the Essenes, that whole movement is the movement that the Dead Sea Scrolls refer to as the Sons of Light and all of that, and which had its origin with the teacher of righteousness. But since they don't refer to themselves as Essenes, I tend not to use that designation as much. But there's this teaching that was developed in the early days of this community, going back to the teacher of righteousness himself. And this is something really important, right? Okay, I want to remind you guys of a few principles. If you want to investigate whether or not someone is teaching truth, what do you start with? And actually, my dad asked me this question recently because he had some Mormons knocking on his door, and he was wondering, how would I go about investigating something like Joseph Smith or whatever? And what I explained to him is the same general principle that I'm about to remind you all of, even though you have heard it before. What you want to do is you want to find the claims which are unique and original to the claimant. The claimant being, the claimer, the person who's making the claim. So in the case of Joseph Smith, you'd want to know, okay, well, what does he say that's different? What does he say that's unique? What are his points of emphasis? What is the thing he's trying to get across that's original to him, that is unique to him? Why do we want to know that? Well, because if you go and you find that he says, oh, Jesus is the Messiah, or Jesus is the Son of God, you can't test him on that. Why? Because he is saying that, but he's not the only one saying that. Many people are saying that. So, if you conclude, oh, well, he must be true because he's saying Jesus is the Son of God, then you have to say that all these other people are true because they're saying that Jesus is the Son of God. But they may have many other contrary claims to each other. So that's not the deciding factor. In other words, it's actually a logical fallacy to say, oh, well, here's one point that is an evidence of the truth of this claimant. But it could also be used to prove another person that is in opposition to the person A. This comes down to an understanding of evidence. If you have one fact that could be used to prove one claim just as much as another claim, it cannot be used as evidence for either. Why? Well, of course, if it can be used for one and another, and those two are conflicting, well, obviously you can't use it as evidence for one or the other, because it's not actually pointing to that unique position, because evidence is a fact or a series of facts which is concordant with one and only one conclusion above all others. So therefore it can't be evidence. It's kind of like one of those charts, maybe Anna, you can help me with the name of it, where you have two overlapping circles.
Venn diagram.
Venn diagram. Thank you. Okay, so you have this Venn diagram. You have two overlapping circles. Okay, well, if you have the part where they overlap in the center, and you list the common points between those two circles, but those two circles represent two different things that overlap. Well, if you can't look at the common points, the points in the overlapping section, and say, oh, well, see, this is proof. Let's say that these are two options. Oh, this is proof for this position. Okay, I'll try to give you a more concrete example. Let's just take Christian Gnostics, and then let's take the Orthodox Christians. Okay, so what do they have in common? Well, what they have in common is they claim that Jesus is a good guy, and that, you know, there's both of them claim that Paul was also a good guy. And they have a bunch that they disagree on, but those are two things that they certainly agree on. Gnostic Christians and what became Orthodox Christians both agreed on some of those things. They also had baptism. They agreed that baptism is something that people are supposed to do. Okay, so those things overlap. That's, if you take two circles, one is Orthodox Christians, one is Gnostic Christians, and they overlap. Okay, well, in that overlap area, you can put belief in Jesus, belief in baptism, belief that Paul was a messenger of Jesus. Okay, so those are things that overlap. Now, you also have stuff that they disagree on, right? So the Gnostics say that the physical world is evil. The Orthodox say that the physical world is good. The Gnostics say that Jesus wasn't really human. He didn't really come in the flesh. The Orthodox say Jesus really was human. He did come in the flesh. Okay, now I can't take a fact. Oh, the Gnostics teach in Jesus and in Paul and in baptism, therefore the Gnostics are the true group. No, you can't use that, because those teachings are not unique to Gnosticism. They didn't originate with Gnosticism. Likewise, they're not unique to Orthodox Christianity, and they didn't originate with Orthodox Christianity. So you cannot use belief in Jesus, belief in Paul, and belief in baptism as evidence for the genuineness or the truth of Orthodox Christianity or of the Gnostic Christian movements. You can't, because they aren't unique for them, and you could use it just as much for either of them. So you could go in totally different directions using the same facts, because those are not unique to either. So that's the sort of thing that I'm talking about. This is dealing with the nature of evidence. Okay, so when we're talking about the teacher of righteousness, we want to know, wait, what are his unique claims? We don't care, in a sense, that the teacher of righteousness believed that the God of Israel is the true God. That's not unique. That was something that preceded him. Isaiah talked about that. Jeremiah talked about that. Ezekiel talked about that. And he's continuing on with that. But there are others who also continued on with that, but went in different directions. So if we want to know if Jesus and John and the followers of Jesus and all that were in harmony with the teacher of righteousness, and if we want to know what they thought about him, we can't just look at the things that he said that he took from elsewhere, because anyone can take things from elsewhere. We want to look at their unique claims. So Joseph Smith, the fact that Joseph Smith believed in the Bible doesn't tell you whether or not he was a true prophet. No, the way it comes to Joseph Smith, what you want to know is, okay, is the Book of Mormon true? That's one of his central claims. Is the Book of Mormon true? Are the other unique teachings of Joseph Smith true? Things unique and original to him. Things that stand out. Things that he was saying in disagreement with his surrounding context. He was promoting polygamy in disagreement with his surrounding context. That was a claim of his message. You had different things like that. Okay, well, you have to investigate him on his unique claims. Same thing with Seventh-day Adventism. Ellen White, what are the unique claims of Ellen White? Okay, investigative judgment for the dead starting October 22, 1844. Okay, after Ellen White, if you find anyone promoting the investigative judgment for the dead starting on October 22, 1844, you know that you're talking Adventism. You know that that person is claiming succession to Ellen White, or claiming to be in agreement with her, or following in a line of thought which emerges from her. No one else other than Ellen White and the movement surrounding her was teaching investigative judgment for the dead, October 22, 1844. Jesus moving from the holy place to the most holy place in the heavenly sanctuary. Those are the unique things. If those things are right, now you're talking about the inspiration of Ellen White. You're talking about either falsifying or verifying her message. So, the teacher of righteousness, what were his unique teachings? What was he saying that was different from those surrounding him in his own context, other people of his time? What was different? What was unique? What was original? That's what we want to know. And what we find is that in these early documents from the Qumran community, the documents which go back to the time of the teacher of righteousness, the documents which can be traced back to him, Thanksgiving hymns, Barki Nafshi, very potentially community rule. What do we find? What is he saying? What is different? Well, there are several things. One of the most significant among these is that the teacher of righteousness developed a teaching that can easily, or that can conveniently be referred to as the teaching of the two ways or the two spirits. The whole world is divided into two categories. Everything is put into this paradigm. You have truth versus error. You have light versus darkness. God versus Satan. The messenger of truth versus the messenger of darkness. The sons of light versus the sons of darkness. All of these terms. Well, to us it sounds kind of familiar, right? But why does it sound familiar to us? Well, it's because we've been reading Nazarene writings. And Nazarene writings, what the Dead Sea Scrolls showed is that they got it from somewhere. They didn't get it from the Sadducees or from the Pharisees or from any of these other groups. They didn't get it from the Old Testament. You don't find that stuff in the Old Testament. Yeah, there's a couple places in Isaiah where you have light and darkness. But man, it's not developed to be a whole teaching. It's not developed to be a paradigm. And that's what it is at Qumran. And not only that, but the terms and phrases that are used to describe that paradigm are unique. The paradigm itself and the terminology. The termini technici, technical terms. And these paradigms and the terms that are used to describe them are precisely those terms and paradigms which show up in the teachings of the followers of Jesus. It shows up in the Didache. The first 6 chapters of the Didache are devoted to the teaching of the two ways. The language that is used is strikingly reminiscent of this section of the community rule. Again, the Didache may be earlier than any document in the New Testament. Its core goes back to the 50s of the 1st century of the Common Era. Paul uses this unique language. It shows up in the Odes of Solomon. It's in the Gospel of John. It's in the Johannine or Johannine epistles, the John epistles. It's in Revelation. It's in the Hebrews. It's in all these early writings of the Nazarene movement. They have this paradigm. There's a whole bunch of other things. There's a covenant and there's a structure of the community which was original to the teacher of righteousness. Unique. No other Jews lived like the Jews surrounding the teacher of righteousness. No one considered anything as their own. They shared. They had a community which was established with people, and they had elders, and they had overseers. These are the terms that are used in the community rule. Oh, wait a second. The early followers of Christ, they lived and shared all things in common, and they didn't consider anything to be their own. That sounds awfully like the community rule and like the group of people surrounding the teacher of righteousness. There were communal daily meals that were put forward by the teacher of righteousness. Well, you have those same things among the teachers or among the Nazarene movement. Not only that, but bread and wine were the two primary elements of the meal. Well, same thing for the Nazarene movement. There is in the Nazarene movement even things that describe very specific things that are like what the teacher of righteousness taught. You have things that are even pretty much direct quotations from the community rule and from the Thanksgiving hymns in the New Testament and other Nazarene writings. And you have things like, how to deal with disputes among the followers of Christ. Well, we have Matthew 18, and you have going and resolving it between the person alone and then having a couple others, and then goes to the community. That's also in the community rule. What did they do? What did Paul do when he went traveling around establishing communities, establishing congregations? Well, he would have elders and overseers that he would appoint over them. That's the same thing in the community rule. There's many, many things. We could go on. Another main thing, the teacher of righteousness and the community surrounding him designated themselves and their movement. They called their whole movement and their way as being the way. They were called the way. They were those of the way. Well, that's unique. No other group of Jews use that terminology to refer to themselves. That's based off of that prophecy in Isaiah 40. Well, that's exactly how the early followers of Christ refer to themselves. There's many, many things that we could look at that were unique to the teacher of righteousness and the community surrounding him. Something totally unlike anyone else in the time of the teacher of righteousness. He had specific teachings, specific paradigms, specific behaviors, ways to live out Judaism. And all of those things are picked up and carried on by the followers of Jesus. Again, those are things unique to the teacher of righteousness. Those things are all picked up, carried on, and expanded. They are built upon. That's showing a continuity. That is something that's highly significant. Another thing is that in the time of the teacher of righteousness, the vast majority of Jews were saying, no more prophets. Well, the followers of Jesus picked this up. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, that community used terms like the spirit of prophecy. Well, that's used by the followers of Jesus. The first place that we know of in Jewish writing where there is developed a specific and a kind of fuller understanding of the Holy Spirit as being a person and as being the person who is actually the Spirit of truth, uses that specific term, the Spirit of truth, and the Spirit who is to purify us from sin and all these other things, all these teachings about the Holy Spirit, that comes from the teacher of righteousness. That's picked up and carried on by John the Baptist. He talks about being purified by the Holy Spirit and so on and so forth, and also by Jesus and his followers. Again, there are many, many things, but it's so much, and it's dealing with the specific and unique and original teachings of the teacher of righteousness that the evidence is overwhelming. That if you were to ask John the Baptist, Moreh Hatzedek, the teacher of righteousness, is he really a teacher of righteousness? Is he really a prophet of Yahweh? Or is he a deceiver? There's no question that John would answer, the teacher of righteousness was a true prophet. If you were to ask Jesus, is the teacher of righteousness a true prophet? Or is he a false prophet? Jesus, without a question, would say he was a true prophet. If you were to ask Paul or John or the author of Hebrews or Peter or James, the brother of Jesus, any of these things, then definitely they would say the teacher of righteousness is a true prophet. There are even indications in the writings of the followers of Jesus that they had something like this covenant ceremony that we read in the community rule. There are many things we could go on and on about the unique things that the teacher of righteousness brought forward that are picked up, carried on, and expanded and built upon by the followers of Christ. With all that, I want to say that one of the main things, though, one of the things that is most central is the teaching of the two spirits, the two ways. It is so key. It was one of the primary teachings of the teacher of righteousness and one of the primary teachings of the followers of Christ. Paul uses it. Jesus used it. The Didache, again, in the New Testament, we don't have kind of a constitution and bylaws of the Nazarene movement. But we do have that in the Didache. And it devotes its first 6 chapters to this teaching, the teaching of the two ways. This is also expanded upon in the Epistle of Barnabas. I believe it's chapters 18 to 20 that are devoted to this topic. But the Didache, that's extremely important. And again, it describes it in the same way as in the community rule, other than the community rule expresses more of a story to these two ways. It doesn't just describe their characteristics. It goes beyond that to describe who rules the way of truth, who rules the way of falsehood, who are the principalities and powers that govern each, and how will the way of truth finally reign, and the way of falsehood finally be brought to an end. So it tells the story of these two ways, these two spirits. It's more explanatory. You know how at the beginning of something, how you have to explain it more, and then once people know what you're talking about, you kind of just have to reference it? That's what it's like in the teachings of the teacher of righteousness and then moving forward into the Nazarene teachings. In the Nazarene teachings, they didn't have to explain it quite as fully because it was already understood. But the Didache, because it's written and the first 6 chapters are specifically saying this is what is to be taught to those who are just joining the faith. And so it explains it more fully there than in any other place. And in the other places, like in Paul's writings and so on, well, he's talking to people. All of Paul's letters are written to people who are already believers. So he's not having to explain it so fully like in the Didache or in the community rule. So he's just referencing it. He talks about the attributes of this way and that way, and he contrasts truth and falsehood, and he contrasts the spirit and the flesh. And, those are all things that are throughout the writings of the Nazarenes. So, I think it's getting late enough that we probably won't get into actually reading the community rule tonight and continuing on, but perhaps tomorrow I'll read again this section of the two ways because it's so important and so clear. So that's certainly a possibility that we could do that. The other possibility, if you guys are right in the zone with it, is that I could just read this section or part of this section without us getting into studying it, and then tomorrow we could get into studying it. Do you guys have thoughts one way or the other as to what you would like us to do?
That would be fine. But maybe somebody else would rather close off.
If I just read it, it shouldn't take too long. But does anyone else have thoughts one way or the other?
Let's read it.
What page is
reading
that?
would be good tonight.
Sure. Okay, so depending on what translation one is reading from in the
I have yours.
Sorry, what?
I have your translation. You can tell me your page.
Okay, so I'm reading from the Giza Vermes translation, which is called The Complete Dead Sea Scrolls in English, published by Penguin Classics. And there are different printings of this same book, even by the same publishers and same translator and everything, that has different pagination, but I know that some of you have the exact same one that I have. And in my copy, this is on page 101. If anyone else is reading from a different translation, this is 1QS, column 3, line, I believe it's line 13. In the translation that I'm reading from, it only tells you which line it is every 5 lines. And what you will find if anyone's reading this same translation, that is Giza Vermes' translation, there will be some things that I will read differently. And the reason why is that I have carefully compared Giza Vermes' translation with the Hebrew of the community rule, along with other translations of the community rule, particularly the Dead Sea Scrolls, a new translation by Martin Abegg, Michael Wise, and another scholar, I forget his name, and then also the Dead Sea Scrolls Study Edition. So those are the 3 primary translations that I have compared, and then also comparing that to the Hebrew text. Okay, so I will read this section again. This is the section called The 2 Ways of the 2 Spirits, starting 1QS, column 3, line around 13. So bless us, Heavenly Family, as we read this. The instructor, or the master, shall instruct all the children of light, and shall teach them the nature of all the children of men according to the kind of their spirit, the signs identifying their works during their lifetime and their visitation for afflictions, together with the time of their reward or their recompense or their restoration or even their peace. The word in Hebrew is shalom, and it carries all those meanings. From the God of knowledge comes all that is and shall be. Before they came to be, he ordered all their designs. And when, as ordained for them, they came into being, it is in accord with his glorious design that they accomplish their task without alteration. The laws of all things are in his hand, and he provides them with all their needs. He has created humanity to govern the world, and has appointed for them 2 spirits with which they may walk until the time of his visitation. They are the spirits of truth and falsehood. From the source of light come all the generations of truth, and from the source of darkness come all the generations of falsehood. In the hand of the Prince of Light is the dominion over all the children of righteousness. In the way of light they walk. And in the hand of the messenger of darkness is the dominion over all the children of falsehood. In the way of darkness they walk. From the messenger of darkness stems the corruption of all the children of righteousness. All their sin iniquities, wickedness, and all their unlawful deeds are at his prompting. God, in his mercies, allows this until his era dawns. And all their afflictions and seasons of distress are caused by his, the angel of darkness, by his diabolical rule. And all the spirits allied with him share but a single resolve, to cause the children of light to fall. But the God of Israel and the messenger of his truth help all the children of light. For it is he who created the spirits of light and darkness. And upon them are built every deed, and upon them are founded every work, and upon their paths all actions. One God loves for all eternal ages, and in all its deeds he is pleased forever. The other he abhors, its counsel and all its paths he hates for all time. These are their ways in the world. The first, for the enlightenment of the mind of man, and so that all the paths of true righteousness may be made straight before him, and so that the fear of the laws of God may be instilled in his mind. It is a spirit of humility, patience, abundant love, unending goodness, understanding, and intelligence. A spirit of mighty wisdom which trusts in all the deeds of God and leans on his great loving kindness. A spirit of discernment in every purpose, of zeal for just laws, of holy intent with steadfastness of heart, of great love towards all the children of truth, of admirable purity which detests all unclean idols, of humble conduct sprung from an understanding of all things, and of faithful concealment of the mysteries of truth. These are the counsels of the Spirit to the children of truth in this world. And as for the reward of all who walk in this Spirit, it shall be healing, great peace in a long life, and fruitfulness, together with every everlasting blessing and eternal joy in life without end, and a crown of glory and a garment of majesty in unending light. But the ways of the spirit of falsehood are these: greed and slackness in the search for righteousness, wickedness and lies, haughtiness and pride, falseness and deceit, cruelty and abundant evil, ill temper and much folly and brazen insolence, abominable deeds committed in a spirit of lust, and ways of lewdness in the service of uncleanness, a blaspheming tongue, blindness of eye and dullness of ear, stiffness of neck and heaviness of heart, so that man walks in all the ways of darkness and guile. And the visitation of all who walk in this spirit shall be a multitude of afflictions by the hand of all the messengers of destruction, everlasting damnation by the avenging wrath of the fury of God, enduring torment and endless disgrace, together with shameful annihilation in the fire of the dark regions. And all the times of their generations shall be spent in sorrowful mourning and in bitter misery and in calamities of darkness, until they are destroyed without remnant or survivor. In these are the generations of all the children of humanity, and in these divisions all their hosts possess an inheritance, for their generations, and in their paths they walk. And the whole reward for their deeds shall be for everlasting ages, according to whether each man's portion in their two divisions is great or small. For God has set these as equals until the final age. And he has placed everlasting enmity between their divisions. Truth abhors the works of falsehood, and falsehood abhors all the ways of truth. And their struggle is fierce in all their arguments, for they do not walk together. But in the mysteries of his understanding and in his glorious wisdom, God has ordained an end for falsehood. And at the time of the visitation, he will destroy it forever. Then truth, which has wallowed in the ways of wickedness during the dominion of falsehood until the appointed time of judgment, shall arise in the world forever. God will then purify every deed of man with his truth. He will refine for himself some from the children of humanity by extinguishing falsehood from the inner bounds of their flesh. He will cleanse him of all his deeds of wickedness with the spirit of holiness. Like purifying waters, he will sprinkle upon him the spirit of truth to cleanse him of all abomination and falsehood. And he shall be plunged into the spirit of purification, that he may instruct the upright in the knowledge of the Most High, and teach the wisdom of the children of heaven to the perfect of way. For God has chosen them for an everlasting covenant, and all the glory of Adam shall be theirs. There shall be no more lies, and all the works of falsehood shall be put to shame. Until now, the spirits of truth and falsehood contend in the minds of men, and they walk in wisdom or in folly. According to his portion of truth and righteousness, so does a man hate falsehood, and according to his inheritance in the lot of falsehood, or in the realm of falsehood, so is he wicked and so hates truth. For God has established the two spirits in equal measure until the determined end and until the renewal. And he knows the results of their deeds for all time. He has allotted them to the children of men, that they may know good and evil, that the lot of all the living may be according to their spirit in the day of their appointed visitation. Amen.
Mm-hmm.
That is the end of the section on the two spirits.
Mm-hmm. Powerful
and the community
section.
Rule. Amen. So we will continue our investigation of this tomorrow evening. As you can see, it's saying something quite profound about the world. And it's really important for us to understand this. This teaching is perhaps even what might be called the central teaching of the Nazarene movement and of the movement of the children of light, the movement of the way, the movement which sprung from the teachings of the teacher of righteousness. There's a reason why it is part of this constitution and bylaws, so to speak, of the Qumran movement. So, anyway, I think that's all for this evening. So if there is any pressing comment or question on this subject from anyone before we close off, you can mention it. But if not, if someone would like to close with thanking our Heavenly Family, then that would be wonderful.
Oh, I have 2 questions in my mind. Maybe we can discuss that tomorrow.
Okay.
First question is, Buddha was a teacher of righteousness. Do you agree? Second, if so, did he know the heavenly family? And the last question is for the reading about the 2 spirits. So it sounds like we only either had the true spirit or the false spirit. But if people are not righteous, they are not born again, we always have the wicked gods controlling us. So the only way to get rid of the wicked gods or be righteous, we have to have the true spirit in us. Yeah, so that's the comment on that.
Okay, and so I will briefly mention it just because I don't think it'll take much time. Victor Houteff, in a certain sermon that he preached, which is recorded in a timely reading, I'm forgetting exactly which number it is, he talks about, I think it's called Shintoism and Progressive Christianity. He speaks of Buddha and Muhammad, and he even mentions Gandhi, and he refers to these individuals as teachers of righteousness. And by that, he simply means that they're teaching to do right. And in my knowledge of these individuals, including Buddha, they were teaching to do right. They were teaching righteousness. Now, I will say, though, that Buddhism today is strikingly different, to my knowledge, from the Buddhism taught by the individual who became known as the Buddha. Initially, if I understand correctly, Buddhism was not actually even a religion. It was more a moral philosophy. And so there's a lot more that I guess could be said and learned about that on my part, along with everyone else, I suppose. So that's in answer to that first aspect. So the answer, I would say yes, according to what I understand, that he was a teacher of righteousness. It does not mean, though, that he understood who the heavenly family was. It just means that in some way they guided him to understand principles of truth and to promote them. Whether he knew who they were or not is another question. Like, he wouldn't necessarily know that there's a father, mother, son, daughter, and that sort of thing. Like I said, it wasn't a primarily religious movement. It was a movement that was more like a teaching of right conduct, moral philosophy. Okay, and then in regard to your last comment about the 2 spirits and how we're either following the truth or following error, and if we're following error, we are in the dominion of the messengers of darkness or the angels of darkness. We could say the wicked gods. That's absolutely correct. Now, I will say that being in the dominion of the wicked gods does not mean that we are forced to sin. We can be urged upon to sin and tempted to sin, but we cannot be forced to sin by these wicked gods. And I know you already understand that, but I wanted to mention it. In the Clementine Recognitions, it specifically talks about that. And, yeah, it's very, very interesting. But we certainly, if we are sinning, we do not have the Spirit of truth. We do not know Christ. We have not received the Spirit of truth and walked in the paths of righteousness, and thus are in the dominion of darkness. But we can be saved from that dominion, and this is the point of the community rule. It's bringing about the wiping away of sin. That's the purpose of it, the final atonement, the final wiping away of sin, the introduction of the truth and the reign of truth. And in order to be saved from falsehood and from lies and from all these awful things that are described as being on the path of falsehood, in order to do that, we must first be aware. We must be made aware of truth and that there is another way. So this is so highly important, so highly significant. So I hope that you guys all consider that. So yes, your last comment was right on target, Rachel. So that said, who would like to thank our Heavenly Family?
I would like to.
Wonderful.
Dear Heavenly Family, Mother, Brother, Sister, and beautiful wisdom, thank you so much for the principles and the Dead Sea Scroll information that you show it to us, and guiding us to see the truth, the light, and the spirits. And I pray that continue provide us more knowledge and education, and to learn and to receive reproof. And thank you so much for your love and your mercy. In the name of the branch, he and she, amen.
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 Toda Elohim. All right, well, love you all. Shabbat Shalom. Lila Tov.
Lila Tov. See you tomorrow.